They say behind every successful man is a strong woman who helped him get there. But what they forget to mention is that sometimes, once that man finally reaches the top of the mountain, he decides the woman who climbed up beside him doesn't fit the aesthetic of the summit anymore. "You're just too much of a reminder of when I was poor, Claire," Dominic said to me, adjusting the $800 silk tie I'd saved for months to buy him as a graduation gift. This was the same man I'd spent 7 years supporting through medical school, working myself into exhaustion so he wouldn't have to worry about money while studying. I had grey hairs at 29 years old from the constant stress of keeping us financially afloat. "I need someone who was born for this life," Dominic continued, not even looking me in the eyes as he spoke. "Not someone who still smells like grease from the diner and floor cleaner from the hospital. You don't understand the world I'm entering now." Then he stepped aside and introduced her, the woman he'd been seeing behind my back for 3 months. Her name was Vanessa, a girl whose only work experience was choosing filters for her social media photos and attending charity galas her parents paid for. He didn't just break my heart that day. He threw me out of the apartment I'd personally paid the deposit on 2 years earlier. He genuinely thought he was trading up to something better. He had no idea he was trading a real diamond for a piece of glittery glass that was about to shatter his entire life into pieces. Dominic had been a brilliant student back when we met in college, but he had absolutely zero survival skills when it came to real life. For 7 full years I was everything he needed: his personal bank, his cook, his editor for papers, his driver to campus, his alarm clock, his therapist when he got stressed. I gave up my own dreams of opening a small bakery so I could work 3 jobs and ensure he became Dr. Dominic Ashford. I worked morning shifts at a diner serving breakfast to truckers and construction workers. I worked afternoon shifts scrubbing floors at the county hospital. I worked weekend shifts doing data entry from home. Every single dollar I earned went toward our bills: his tuition, his books, his supplies, our rent. The day Dominic got his first contract at an exclusive private medical clinic, everything changed in ways I didn't see coming. The contract was worth 6 figures in the first year alone, with promises of much more as he built his patient list. Suddenly he started attending what he called elite networking mixers, events for wealthy doctors and their equally wealthy friends. He bought expensive suits I'd never seen before. He started coming home later and later, smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. That's where he met Vanessa at one of those fancy parties. She told him he was a king who deserved a queen by his side. According to his new way of thinking, I was just the peasant who'd helped him win the war but didn't belong at the victory celebration. The divorce papers arrived by courier on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for my diner shift. Dominic didn't even have the courage to hand them to me himself. The settlement he offered was insulting: a measly $10,000 for what he called my troubles. 7 years of sacrifice, of working until my hands bled and my feet swelled, of giving up everything I wanted so he could have everything he needed, and he valued all of that at $10,000. The papers included a suggestion, written by his new lawyer, that I should start over somewhere far away from the city. Somewhere I wouldn't embarrass him by running into his new social circle. I signed those papers with shaking hands, took the money, and walked away from the life I'd built for us. I didn't let myself cry for very long, maybe a week at most. Then I dried my tears, pulled out the secret savings account I'd been quietly building for 3 years, and made a decision that changed everything. I'd been putting away small amounts of money whenever I could, calling it our future home fund. Dominic never knew about it because he never asked about our finances beyond whether his bills were paid. That account had grown to $18,000. Combined with the divorce settlement, I had $28,000 total. It wasn't much, but it was enough to finally open that bakery I'd been dreaming about since I was a teenager. I was going to build something that was completely mine, something nobody could take away from me. I didn't just want to bake ordinary cakes and cookies that anyone could make. I wanted to build a real brand, something special that people would remember and come back for. I called my bakery the Rising Crust, a name that meant something to me about starting from the bottom and working your way up. I rented a tiny storefront in a neighborhood that was just starting to improve, where the rent was cheap enough that I could afford it. I spent my days baking from scratch using my grandmother's old recipes that I'd learned as a kid. I spent my nights cleaning and doing my own bookkeeping to save money. Those first 6 months were brutally hard, working alone for 16 hours a day, but slowly people started noticing my baked goods were different, better, made with actual care. While I was building my bakery from nothing, Dominic was busy building what he thought was a perfect new life with Vanessa. I heard about it through mutual friends who couldn't resist telling me the gossip. He bought her a $20,000 designer handbag for her birthday. He took her on private jet trips to beach resorts I'd never even dreamed of visiting. He proposed to her with a ring that cost more than I'd earned in an entire year of working 3 jobs. They got married at an expensive venue with 500 guests, all wealthy and important people I'd never met. From the outside, it looked like he'd made the right choice leaving me behind. But I was too busy working to care much about what Dominic was doing with his life anymore. By the end of my first year, the rising crust had become popular enough that I could hire 2 part-time employees to help with the early morning baking. By the end of year 2, I had 4 full-time employees and was looking at opening a second location across town. People loved that everything was made fresh daily using real ingredients instead of the cheap mixes that most bakeries used. Food bloggers started writing about us. Local newspapers did feature stories. I got approached by a wedding planner who wanted to use our cakes exclusively for all her high-end events. Money was still tight and I worked constantly, but it was my work, my business, my dream finally becoming real. I felt proud of myself for the first time in years. Year 3 brought changes I never could have imagined. A buyer from a major supermarket chain came into my bakery, tasted our cinnamon rolls, and offered me a distribution deal on the spot. They wanted to sell frozen versions of our most popular items in 300 stores across 5 states. The contract was worth more money than I'd ever seen in my life. I hired a lawyer to review everything, then signed the deal with hands that shook from excitement instead of fear this time. Within months, the rising crust went from being a local bakery to a regional brand that people recognized. I opened my 3rd location, then my 4th, then my 5th. I hired a management team so I wasn't working 16-hour days anymore. I became a real business owner, not just a person who owned a business. By year 4, I was no longer the girl who smelled like grease and floor cleaner. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar food company with 37 employees, a business manager, and a marketing team. I'd been featured in several business magazines as an entrepreneur to watch. I bought myself a beautiful house on 3 acres of land outside the city, the kind of place I used to dream about when I was scrubbing hospital floors. The house had a main building and a separate guest house on the property. I hired a head of security named Raymond, a retired police officer who lived in the guest house and kept an eye on things. I drove a custom electric SUV that didn't make noise and got looks everywhere I went. I'd built the life I deserved through my own hard work. Meanwhile, Dominic's perfect life was falling apart in ways he never saw coming, though I didn't know the details yet. What I learned later was that Vanessa had never actually loved him as a person. She loved the idea of being married to a successful doctor, of having access to his bank accounts and his earning potential. She was sweet and supportive as long as the money kept flowing freely, but she had plans of her own that Dominic was too blind to notice. She convinced him to put her name on all his bank accounts as a sign of trust and commitment. She convinced him to put the deed to their mansion in only her name for tax purposes that she claimed would save them money. Dominic, desperate to prove he trusted his beautiful young wife, agreed to everything she suggested. Then Vanessa made her biggest move. She introduced Dominic to her cousin Andre, a smooth-talking guy who claimed to be starting a revolutionary tech company. Andre's startup was supposedly developing some kind of medical software that would change healthcare forever and make early investors incredibly wealthy. Vanessa pushed Dominic constantly, telling him this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to multiply his money. She said a real power couple would take smart risks together. Dominic, wanting to impress her and prove he was more than just a doctor, invested his entire savings into Andre's company. $250,000 disappeared into a business that existed mostly on paper and fancy presentations. Vanessa praised him for being so bold and forward-thinking. He felt like a genius investor. 6 months after Dominic's investment, Andre's tech startup vanished overnight. The office closed, the website went dark, and Andre's phone number stopped working. On that same day, Vanessa disappeared too. Dominic came home from work to find their mansion completely empty. She'd hired movers and taken every piece of furniture, every painting, every expensive item they'd bought together. She'd drained all their joint bank accounts down to 0. Because the house deed was in only her name, she'd legally sold the property to a buyer she'd already lined up. Dominic received an eviction notice giving him 30 days to leave what he'd thought was his own home. Vanessa and Andre were already on a plane to Dubai, where they'd apparently been planning to move together for months. Andre wasn't her cousin. He was her actual boyfriend, and the whole thing had been an elaborate con. Dominic was left with his medical degree, his job at the clinic, and absolutely nothing else. No savings, no house, no wife, no furniture, not even his expensive clothes because Vanessa had taken those too. Even worse, he discovered he'd forgotten to pay his malpractice insurance premiums for the past 8 months because Vanessa had been handling their bills and had simply stopped paying that one. Without insurance, he couldn't legally practice medicine. The insurance company demanded $400,000 in back payments and penalties before they'd reinstate his coverage. His clinic immediately suspended him without pay until he fixed the insurance problem. In the span of a single week, Dominic went from thinking he was living a perfect life to having less than nothing. I knew none of this was happening to Dominic because I'd successfully moved on with my life and stopped paying attention to his. I was busy running my business and enjoying the success I'd built. Then one morning, I got a call from a reporter at Business Insider magazine. They wanted to do a cover story about the rising crust and my journey from working 3 jobs to building a food empire. I agreed to the interview, spent 3 hours telling my story honestly, and forgot about it for weeks until the magazine hit stands. Seeing my face on that cover, reading the headline, From Diner Waitress to Bakery Mogul, One Woman's Rise, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that Dominic's approval had never given me. 2 days after the magazine came out, I was leaving my office at 6 in the evening, tired from a long day of meetings about our expansion into 2 new states. I walked across the parking lot toward my SUV, already thinking about the quiet evening at home I had planned. Then I noticed a man standing beside my car, waiting. He was wearing an old suit that looked like it had been nice once, but now hung loose on his frame like it was 2 sizes too big. His face was thin and sunken, with dark circles under his eyes. It took me a full 10 seconds to recognize him because he looked so different from the confident, well-fed man who'd divorced me. It was Dominic, and he looked absolutely terrible. "Claire," he said, his voice rough and desperate. "I need to talk to you, please just give me 5 minutes." I stood there holding my car keys, debating whether to just get in and drive away without saying a word, but curiosity won. "What do you want, Dominic?" I asked, keeping my voice flat and emotionless. He took a deep breath and it all came spilling out. Vanessa's betrayal, the stolen money, the lost house, the insurance debt, the suspended medical license, the fact that he was currently sleeping on a friend's couch and that friend had asked him to leave by the end of the week. He looked broken in a way I'd never seen before, all his confidence and arrogance completely gone. "I made a terrible mistake leaving you," Dominic said, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "I was blinded by stupidity and ego. I lost everything that mattered because I was chasing something shallow and fake. I know I don't deserve your help, but I saw that you bought that beautiful estate on the hill outside town. The article mentioned you have a guest house on the property. I thought maybe for old time's sake, for the 7 years we spent together, you might let me stay there temporarily. Just until I can get back on my feet financially and figure out my next steps. I don't have anywhere else to go, Claire, I'm desperate." He actually reached out like he was going to touch my arm, but I stepped back. I looked at this man who'd once told me I was too much of a reminder of being poor, that I didn't fit the aesthetic of his successful new life. I looked at him standing in a parking lot begging for a room in my guest house, and I felt absolutely nothing except maybe a distant sense of irony. "Dominic," I said slowly, pulling out my car keys and pressing the button that made my expensive SUV's lights flash. "The guest house isn't available. Raymond, my head of security, lives there full-time, and honestly, even if it was empty, I wouldn't let you stay." His face fell even further if that was possible. "But Claire, please," he started. I held up my hand to stop him from continuing. "You are a reminder to me," I continued, keeping my voice steady and calm. "But not the reminder you think. You remind me of a version of myself I never want to see again. The version who let a man use her as a stepping stone to climb higher while giving nothing back. The version who thought love meant sacrifice without appreciation. The version who believed that if I just worked hard enough and gave enough, eventually I'd be valued for it. That version of me died when you handed me those divorce papers, and I'm grateful to you for killing her. She was holding me back from becoming who I was always meant to be." Dominic stared at me like I'd slapped him across the face. I pulled a business card from my purse, but it wasn't my business card. It was one I'd picked up from a community center months ago and kept meaning to throw away. "There's a shelter on Marshall Street that helps people in tough situations," I said, handing him the card. "They have beds, food, and resources for job hunting. They can probably help you more than I ever could." Dominic looked at the card in his hand like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. A homeless shelter. You're sending me to a homeless shelter. His voice cracked with disbelief. You're a millionaire now and you can't spare one room. I opened my car door and looked back at him one final time. You made it very clear that I didn't belong in your world, Dominic. Now I'm making it clear that you don't belong in mine. I got in my SUV and drove away, watching him get smaller in my rearview mirror until he disappeared completely. I didn't feel guilty or sad or even particularly angry. I just felt free, like I'd finally closed a chapter of my life that should have ended years earlier. That night, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea, looking out over my property, and thought about how far I'd come from that scared 22-year-old girl who'd thought working 3 jobs for someone else's dream was what love looked like. I'd learned that real love, the kind that actually matters, starts with loving yourself enough to know what you deserve. And I deserved so much more than Dominic had ever been willing to give. I heard through old mutual friends over the following months what happened to Dominic after that night in the parking lot. He eventually found a job as a general practitioner at a rural clinic 4 hours outside the city, the only place that would hire him with his insurance situation and reputation problems. The job paid a fraction of what he'd made at the private clinic, barely enough to cover his living expenses and make minimum payments on his debt. He moved into a tiny studio apartment above a convenience store that smelled like old grease from the restaurant next door. He worked double shifts trying to pay back what he owed, coming home exhausted to an empty apartment every night. He'd finally gotten the life he'd once told me I deserved, while I was living the life I'd actually worked for. 5 years have passed since that day in the parking lot. The Rising Crust now has 23 locations across 8 states and annual revenue that still surprises me when I see the numbers. I've been invited to speak at business conferences about entrepreneurship and overcoming adversity. I've started a foundation that gives small business loans to women trying to start their own companies, especially women leaving difficult situations who need a fresh start. I bought my parents a house and paid off their debts. I travel when I want, work when I want, and answer to nobody but myself. Sometimes I think about Dominic and wonder if he ever realized that the woman he threw away like garbage was actually the most valuable thing he'd ever had in his life. But mostly I don't think about him at all anymore. I'm too busy enjoying the view from the summit I climbed all by myself, building a life that smells like fresh bread and success, instead of regret and floor cleaner. And that's exactly how it should be. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe and comments. Check out some more of our stories.